All righty then. Hello, everybody. Um, my name's Carl Binder, and this is my friend and colleague Shane Isley. And we're going to get started with this session. Looks like people still filtering in, but we want to use our time efficiently. And this, of course, will be recorded. So if you miss our initial introductory remarks, you'll get a link to the recording in, I think, 36 hours from when we end it. We're going to try to stay within an hour, but we might be a little bit longer than an hour. We've got a lot to talk about today, and we want to give you some background about performance thinking before we sort of launch into details about how we've applied it and how the work that Shane has done in ABA organizations. So we might take a little bit longer than an hour, and if you've just scheduled an hour for it, don't feel badly if you have to drop off. Again, you'll be able to catch the whole thing in a recording later. So here's our agenda for the day. We're gonna talk a little bit about what's coming up in this series, because this is part of a monthly series of free webinars. And then we're going to give you an overview of what we call performance thinking, the performance improvement methodology that we've developed over the years. And partly because we know behavior analysts know a lot and have often a background in the science. And we think you'd probably be interested in some of the at least a high-level review of the nuts and bolts of performance thinking and how it evolved. And then we want to talk about some of the big challenges in ABA companies that we've certainly identified in our work over the years, and some insights and examples. And I'm going to want to then kind of interview Shane, because Shane is, as he'll introduce himself shortly, but for those of you who don't know Shane, Shane's been both an ABA company owner and also performance improvement consultant for quite a few years. And so he has a lot of experience in ABA companies. And then we'll have some Q&A time, depending on how long we take to do this. So I wanted to mention to you that our next performance thinking webinar, free webinar, is going to be on January 13th. And anybody who's attending here will certainly be on the mailing list for how to register. But we're looking forward to that, because we've recognized that the work that we do has a lot of implications for how leaders and managers approach their job. That's coming up in January. And we've got some other ones. We're going to talk about our coaching and supervision model next year at one of the webinars. We're going to talk with Bill Blunt, we think, from Amgen, which is one of our longest running corporate clients. They've been using performance thinking for about over 10 years now. And Bill was a person who essentially got it started there 10 years ago, and he really spread performance thinking virally to the point that now they have certified performance thinking practitioners, almost 300 of them around the globe in their various settings. And we're going to talk about sustaining performance thinking culture in a global organization as it grows. How do you keep the community going? How do you keep learning with and from one another inside of an organization? We're going to talk about agile talent development and a bunch of other topics, but those are some of the upcoming things for 2021. So we want to find a little bit about you at this point. And so we're going to do a few simple polls. And hopefully, if I run them properly this time, you'll be able to see the results of the polls. But I want to start with one just to see who's here. So I think on your screen, you should see a set of options. And although some of you may serve in more than one role, we'd appreciate it if you'd at least select the one that best fits your current role. So thank you. You guys are starting to respond. Pretty interesting. Some CEOs and owners, some operations folks, teachers and practitioners. It's quite a good mix here. I'm going to wait until it sort of settles out, till everybody's had a chance to respond. Looks like a lot of operations directors or managers type of folks. That's great, because I think what we're going to be talking about, especially around processes, for example, will be directly relevant to you all. Some HR folks and training people. We've recently started working with one of the larger ABA organizations who ask us to help them refine and define their training function. And we said, well, we'll be happy to help you turn it into a performance improvement function. So this is a good mix. Looks like most people have responded. So let me just end the poll, and I think I can. I'm hoping, maybe not. Can you see the poll results at this point? or not?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Oh, you can. Okay, good deal.
Yep.
Yeah, you can. You're a presenter. I wonder if other folks can. Anyway, it looks like there's a small number of owners, investors, about 10% are presidents or CEOs or executive directors, more operations folks than anybody else, some HR, a few clinical supervisors, some practitioners, and some others. So that's great. So I want to do another poll that will, I guess I'll reset that. And now we want to learn a little bit about sort of the geographical extent, if you will, of your organizations. We want to get a sense of whether you're a single location ABA organization, whether you have multiple locations within a region, or whether you're big, multi-state, national one. All right, there's a lot of in each category, it looks like. So this is quite interesting as well. Because what we see is that ABA companies of different sizes, have different challenges, as I'm sure you all know. When you're just starting up and you're trying to get things in place, but then you start growing, there's a lot of growth pains that happen, and those can be supported. You can build out an infrastructure for growth to support that. And of course, as you start having multiple locations, you start to see, whoa, there's a whole bunch of issues around making things replicable. And then we got more big companies, multi-state and national companies than any others. So that's good to know. Thank you for filling out the thing. And then there's one more, and this has mostly to do with sort of how many people work in your organization. And I'm betting there's a bunch of pretty big ones, because a number of you said you were multi-location. So let's see. It's kind of like a race here. We got some 1,000 or more employees. We got a lot of ones under 200, looks like, more than half right now. But let's see how that's going. So quite interesting. Yeah, this is a good mix. I mean, as I said, one of the things I think we've observed so far is that different sizes of organizations, not only in terms of number of locations, but also how many employees have different challenges. So thank you for filling this out. Looks like just about everybody's responded. So that's really helpful. I want to go back to our slides and talk a little bit about ourselves. I just tell you a brief kind of backgrounder for me. As I often say, I'm 71 years old, and I started doing ABA before it was called that. I was a student with B.F. Skinner in the 70s, and I worked in Beatrice Barrett's laboratory and started up her classroom in the 70s as a precision teaching classroom, and we worked with folks in the institution. And then I actually trained teachers, master students, and practitioners, and also consulted to agencies and programs around the country for probably a decade or so. And then at some point in the early 80s, Og Lindsley said, I want you to take what we've learned in precision teaching into companies. And so I didn't really know what to do about that, but I did, and wound up learning about performance improvement more broadly than just the instructional component. Was mentored to some extent by Tom Gilbert and some of the other kind of thought leaders in the field of performance improvement, and then evolved this work that we call performance thinking. And I still have a remarkable number of friends and colleagues in the ABA world, even though I've only been tangentially involved with that. And I'm really happy to be working with Shane, because Shane's sort of participated in all the different levels of this work, both as an owner and somebody managing and running an ABA company, and also now as a consultant. So do you want to say a few words about yourself, Shane, just to give some background?
Yeah. Well, at first I should probably say that I'm not 71 years old. I just recently celebrated my 40th birthday, so it's a great honor to get to work with Carl, with all of his experience and expertise. As he was saying, I'm a consultant for the Performance Thinking Network, and I'm currently leading the company's emerging performance thinking for behavioral health, or ABA organization, service line. And this is really the only industry I've ever really worked in is behavioral health. I was fortunate to go to undergrad and graduate school in behavior analysis at North Texas, and study with some amazing people like Shala Ale, and I learned OBM from Dr. Cloyd Heighton, and like Carl said, I've started businesses and owned a couple behavioral health organizations where we actually were one of the first affiliates in the ABA market segment to provide the management program. And so, yeah, just excited to be doing this webinar, and looking forward to continue helping more behavioral health organizations grow with quality and ethically.
Fantastic. Thank you, Shane. So I'm going to sort of move into fire hose mode a little bit for a few minutes. But I want to do a kind of sort of an interview really with Shane a little bit later to ask him about some specific examples, cases, and so forth. But I like to start with this. This is just one example of what we heard from one growing ABA company owner, and I'm kind of proud of it, really. But this is an organization that started in one location, has a number of locations now, and has been growing pretty fast over the last few years. And she said, she actually said this in public at one point, and I said, "Really?" And she said, "Yep." And she said, "Performance thinking has had a measurable impact on my company. Our staff retention rate has increased immensely. New applicants report to us that they hear we're a preferred place to work. Employee satisfaction and engagement have increased. It helped us to move from being a struggling company to one with the tools to overcome any performance obstacle successfully." And of course, that makes me feel really good, because that's really what we're trying to help. We're trying to help organizations move through the growth process, often beyond a single location and so forth. And then medium and size and larger organizations to really get what we think of as performance infrastructure in place, so that you have a solid, business foundation for, again, growth and delivery of quality services. I always like to tell people, and this is kind of the overview thing we're moving into here. I like to tell people where this came from. And of course, I was a student. I was one of Skinner's last students, and we've all benefited from Dr. Skinner's contributions, of course. In my case, I learned a lot from him, but I think mostly I learned that if we take a natural science approach to our own behavior, we can improve things. And that's what got me excited back when I wrote him a fan letter in the late 60s, and he responded, and that we could improve instruction and management and therapy and all the rest of it. And so that was a big contribution. And then Tom Gilbert, who was one of the really thought leaders in the field of performance improvement, or what some people have called human performance technology. I had the good luck of being introduced to his work by Eric Haughton in the late 70s, when Tom published his work, Human Competence. And then I got to know Tom and his wife, Marilyn, in the early 80s, and they sort of mentored me in a lot of ways. And you'll see that this work, if you aren't already familiar with our work, comes pretty directly out of some of Tom's major contributions. Harless was also a mentor and colleague of mine, and he was a protege of Gilbert, and he took Gilbert's work, which was conceptual and very powerful, but not exactly systematic, and he turned it into methodologies that were replicable, so that Harless went into companies like Boeing and other giant companies and was able to develop many people doing accomplishment-based instructional design, doing performance improvement. So Harless was kind of somebody who showed how to turn a methodology into something that could be delivered to other people. And he was, again, a kind of a mentor and friend of mine for many years. And then Ogden Lindsley, who was one of my earliest mentors. I knew Og for 20 some years, or 30 some years. Well, no, let's see about that. Yeah, about 30 years. He, of course, as many of you know, brought Skinner science into application. But beside measurement and beside, applying human operant condition with humans, Ogden was very big on the use of plain English. And what he did when he moved from Harvard Medical School in his basic research world into teaching teachers and special ed teachers at Kansas University in the 60s, is he took the jargon from behavior analysis, from behavior science, and turned it into plain English terminology. Because as he pointed out, when you go into another community, you have to learn how to speak in ways that they understand. And that was a big, big message for me. And then, of course, and everybody thinks this is a kind of a marketing bit or something, but Ogden also introduced me to Steve Jobs' work and to the Apple computer. Ogden was one of the earliest adopters of the Apple II computer in the late 70s. He used to always bring his Apple IIs to conferences and, be doing early software stuff with Apple IIs. And so he turned me on to Jobs, and I wound up sort of paying attention to Steve for a long time, for his entire career. Jobs, among other things, was about simplicity. If you think about what he did with Steve Wozniak in the beginning, they took sort of hobbyist technology where you had to solder stuff together and it was very nerdy, and they created the Apple II computer, which, you know, a housewife or a person running their business could use without knowing anything about how the technology worked, but could, you know, save their recipes or do their accounting or whatever in a package. And so there's a book that I recommend to anybody who's interested called Insanely Simple, which was about Jobs' work. And this is a long quote, but I'm going to read it anyway. Some of you have probably heard me say it. But when Steve really drove simplicity through his organization in a whole lot of different ways, and both at Next Computer and at Apple. And he said, when you start looking at a problem and it seems really simple with all these simple solutions, you don't really understand the complexity of the problem. And then you get into the problem and you see it's really complicated. And I would say that there's something like that with human performance in organizations. And he says, and then you come up with all these convoluted solutions. And that's sort of the middle. And it's where most people stop. And the solutions tend to work for a while, but you can keep on going and find the key underlying principle of the problem and come up with a beautiful, elegant solution that works. Now, as I often say, I'm no Steve Jobs, but I think the process that we've taken from really the early 80s to now in taking performance improvement, behavioral systems, all of that work, and turning it into a plain English methodology and framework that we now call performance thinking, that we can teach to anybody, is kind of an example of what Steve was talking about. Because if you look at the field of performance improvement or organizational behavior management, it's not simple. And before our work, I would say it's generally been pretty complicated. This is just one example. And many of you probably who have backgrounds in OBM or performance know this, that those, you know, people who've developed these methodologies for improving performance in organizations are very smart people, and they've created models that were very powerful. But when they've tried to communicate them or introduce them to ordinary people in companies, there's often been kind of a negative response. And this is just one example. I was a very active contributor and participant in the International Society for Performance Improvement for several decades, you know, got all their awards and all the rest of it. But one of the things that I noticed was that I had colleagues there who would say, we love this performance improvement stuff, but it's kind of too complicated. And so we really kind of set out 20 years ago, roughly, to help improve that. Because what would happen was folks would say, it's too complicated, or our leaders say, this is analysis paralysis, or it's just, you know, there's too much here. And so we came up with what's turned out to be really a new idea. And that is this notion that we can, in fact, analyze and communicate about performance in ways that are actionable and evidence-based. And all the methodologies are about that, you know, whether they're sort of OBM types of things or human performance improvement, they're all about that, hopefully. But what's different in our work is that we use simple visual models and plain language to communicate this, as you'll see. And that allows us to go across all levels and functions in companies with the same vocabulary, the same models, the same thought process. And it means that we can work in organizations to build communities of practice. So people learn from one another and they collaborate and continuously improve. And 15 years ago, 10 to 15 years ago, our clients started telling us, you know, you're giving us a methodology here, but what you're really doing is helping us think differently about performance. So at some point, I think it's been about 12 years ago now, we said, we're going to call this performance thinking. So that's the notion. And what I want to do is give you a very high level overview of sort of where this came from in the conceptual sense. And what I would propose is that if you're going to improve performance, if you're going to be either a leader, manager, or a performance improvement consultant, or an HR person, or anybody in the role which would have you improving performance, you got to have crisp, explicit, clear answers to each of these three questions. First of all, what is human performance? And if we were in a room, we had flip charts and so forth, and I'd probably ask you, and people would come up with things like, well, it's people behaving or producing results or, you know, contributing to the organization or whatever. They'd come up with a lot of words, and probably all of them would have been fine. But as behavior scientists, we know that it's critical to have what we call units of analysis. And so we need an explicit, clear definition of performance that has identifiable, consistent units of analysis. And we'll show you what that is shortly. And then once you got that, what influences human performance? And of course, as behaviorists, we tend to use the three-term contingency from Skinner's work. As you'll see, we learned something sort of more robust from Tom Gilbert, and then we turned it into the 6 boxes model. And then if you have answers to these questions, like what do you do with them? And so we'll show you very high level what the kind of log is that we teach people. So first question, what is human performance? And we can talk about this, and we do in our, for example, practitioner program for a good many sessions. But as many people say, I love this quote. I almost stick it in here just because I love the quote in the picture. But you know, George Bernard Shaw said, "All great truths begin as blasphemies." And Tom Gilbert started out doing instruction. He was professor at the University of Alabama. He did a postdoc for a while at Harvard, involved in program instruction. But then he started to move into the field of performance improvement and became one of the thought leaders or originators of that. And in his now rather famous book, Human Competence, he did a kind of a poke in the eye thing. He was an iconoclast, and he said, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. Now, he wasn't really pointing at us behaviorists. He was more pointing at leaders and managers and training professionals, how they were always focused on behavior. But what he pointed out was that if we're going to make an impact, we must enable people to produce what he called accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. And that was earth-shaking. That was paradigm shifting. And for me, when I encountered Tom's book, and then when I met him in the early 80s, it changed the world pretty considerably. And we call accomplishments work outputs, as you'll see in our models. And the reason we do that is because the word accomplishments has been adopted by a lot of people, but it means a lot of different things. Some people think it's organizational business results. Some people think it means changes in behavior. There's a whole lot of words and that, you know, and things that people use that word to refer to. As you'll see, we talk about work outputs, which are countable products of individual, process, or group behavior. So this is our first model, first of our 2 simple models, and we call it the performance chain. And we can drill into it quite a lot, but ultimately it says that we start with organizational or business results. We want to know what's at stake for the organization. And so in ABA organizations, there's the usual revenue and profit, but there's also client success or progress. There's employee engagement, employee retention. There's operational efficiency. There's a whole bunch of things that are the things that we look at the whole organization and say, is it being successful? And once we know what's at stake in any given situation or for any given company, then we identify what we call work outputs. And those are the things, the countable things that people produce. And some of them are tangible, deliverables, you know, things like treatment plans or strategic plans or session notes. But some of them are less tangible. They're things like decisions or relationships. And those are also work outputs or accomplishments. Once we've figured out what those are that are involved in a particular chunk of performance, now we're in a strong position to figure out what the behavior is. We can do task analysis, we can observe people, we can interview exemplary performers, but we can now zero in on the actual behavior that's needed to produce those work outputs. And then, in order to improve or affect those behavior influences, which are really not part of performance, they're the things that influence performance, are the first part of the chain. So in the ABA world, if you can see that slide, there's lots of work outputs, and that's just a few examples. But trying to connect up with the work that you might do, we want to be clear that these are the things that people in your organizations need to produce, and a whole lot more. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how to identify those. So that's the quick and dirty, what is human performance? And so the second question is, okay, so we know human performance is behavior that produces work outputs that are valuable to the extent they contribute to organizational results. So, okay, what influences performance? So, you know, we behaviorists started out with Skinner. You know, discriminative stimuli set the occasion for responses that hopefully lead to reinforcing stimuli. And then that was kind of plain Englished by people where they talked about antecedents, behavior, and consequences. But what Tom Gilbert recognized in his behavior engineering model, and that's what we're looking at here, is that we're not white Carnot pigeons. We're not hooded rats. We are all individually different, not only as individuals, but also in organizations and cultures. There's a lot of variability that is not just those three-term contingencies. So what Tom did is he said there's two rows here in this model. There's the environment, and our environment gives us information in the form of what he called data, which helps us know what we're trying to accomplish and how we're doing. And it gives us instruments, which is the word he used for sort of environmental factors that affect us as we're performing. It's kind of like the manipulanda in a operant conditioning chamber, but it's a lot more than that, as you well know. And then incentives is the word he used to talk about consequences. But he recognized that if we're looking at individuals or groups, there's a whole thing that has to do with the people involved, the person, as it says on the picture here, that the person brings information to the table too in the form of knowledge. The person has capacity, and by that we mean analytical enough to be a behavior analyst, strong enough to be a dock worker, sociable enough to be a salesperson, and much more. But both the sort of entering repertoire that we need a person to have, and also their motives, their values, their preferences that help us identify how we will align them or assign them to jobs and tasks. And then motives was Gilbert's way, I think, of talking about functional analysis of reinforcers. Because if, we can offer incentives, but as you well know, they may not be reinforcers. And so we have to align with individuals and teams' values and preferences to be sure we've got incentives that are going to work. And beyond that, we might also provide information in the form of expectations and feedback. We might provide tools, and those all ought to be adapted to people's motives and preferences. So that's the quick and dirty version of this model. We could spend days on it, but I encountered it in the early 80s when I was starting to work with salespeople, and we were taking from precision teaching, fluency-based instruction and coaching, and developing fluent salespeople in banks and high-tech companies and other places. And what we recognized was we could do the best training, we could be down in the knowledge there, but if we didn't arrange those conditions on the top row, it wasn't going to stick. We weren't going to get changes in performance. So this was very powerful to me and the teams that I was working with, but of course we were all kind of performance nerds, and we liked the language. When we started to present this language to our clients, they would be like, what do you mean by data? Is that spreadsheets or databases? What is that, Or instruments, what does that mean? And so the language was not clear to people. And we had to keep kind of explaining it again and reminding them, and they still made category errors. So between about 1984 and the end of the 80s, I started tweaking the language. And I kept tweaking it to see what would happen as I tried to train and develop people until I finally got it, essentially user tested it. And the language of what we now call the 6 boxes model, people didn't make mistakes. There were countless times when I'd be, walking out of a consulting engagement maybe, and somebody would say, hey, Carl, I've got an issue over here. Can you help me with that? And so I'd draw out this model on a piece of paper or literally an envelope sometimes, and I'd talk them through it, and they would kind of get it, 10 or 15 minutes maybe, and I'd come back days, weeks later, and they'd say, I've been using that. And they had, not in complex, sophisticated ways, but they didn't make category errors. So we started using this language in the model. So expectations and feedback are the information needed to know what to do and produce and how I'm doing. And it comes from a lot of different sources. And tools and resources are all the things, not just the software and hardware and screwdrivers and room arrangements and plexiglass walls to keep us from getting COVID and all the rest of it, but also the human resources we need, all the things we need enabled to be able to perform, as well as things like reference documents, job aids, and so forth. Process design, workflow, there's a lot in that category, and it makes a huge difference because, of course, for example, if you have a piece of software you're supposed to be using as a tool and it's really difficult, well, it's going to get in your way, and you might work around it, and it's also going to be punishing, and you'll have unintended consequences, which of course is box 3. And the reason we call box 3 consequences and incentives is because some things are incentives. You know in advance if you perform in a particular way, there'll be some reinforcer. But a lot of times there's unintended consequences. And so we wanted to be sure that that was stood also. And then the bottom row, we talk skills and knowledge, which is essentially the repertoire that people need in order to do something. And we develop that, but notice it's not the training box, because there's a lot of ways to deliver skills and knowledge, often that are less expensive, less time consuming. You know, frequent expectation setting and feedback, good job aids with, the right books, etc. So this is the skills and knowledge box, not just the training box. Selection and assignment really points to what Tom meant by capacity. That is, how do we decide who to hire and how to assign them to jobs and tasks? And then finally, we called motives and preferences. And we put attitude in there, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. But the notion is, not only do we want to understand what you care about, what values you have, whether you like the kind of work we want to hire you into, whether you like the way expectations are being set, whether you want feedback in private or in groups, all those things. But we also have learned that over time, the environment you're working in will make you either very positive about coming to work in the morning or not so positive. And we'll come back to that later. So this is the model. This is the other model that we use, the 6 boxes model. And when I first introduced it, it took off like crazy in the late 80s. But I was still saying, oh, this is like Tom Gilbert's thing, but different language and all that. And finally, one of my clients, who was a vice president of sales training at Dun Bradstreet in about 92, said, well, you're always talking about those boxes. Why don't you call it the 6 boxes? So that's what we started doing. So that answers what influences human performance. And then let me just show you the kind of framework we use for how we apply these things, which is that you put the 2 models together and you say, okay, let's start up, be sure we know what's at stake for the business or the organization in this project or this process or this for this individual or for the whole company. Now let's look at whatever performance we're interested in and be sure we've identified the work outputs that are the valuable contributions of that performance. Now we're in a strong position to figure out what the behaviors for producing that. And once we've defined those 3 things, we're in a very strong position to decide what to measure. Can we get business results that are relevant? We may not be able to get them very often, but we still need to look at that. Can we look at work outputs and count the good ones and bad ones, the treatment plans that meet criteria and that don't, the instructional decisions that are good ones, the new hires that do, etc. And then, of course, we all know we can measure behavior. Once we've done that, we then look at the 6 boxes. We see what's working and what's not. We then brainstorm possible improvements, and then along with our stakeholders, we choose them and we implement and adjust. So again, this is the quick and dirty logic, but that's the logic that we teach people, whether they're being performance consultants doing projects that take 3 years, like an Amgen, or whether they're coaches sitting down with somebody problem solving something in 20 minutes. That logic turns out to be very powerful. And because of the language in the 2 models, we found that we can teach it to anybody at any level, at any function. This happens to not be an ABA picture because you can see there's some frontline people in a factory there, but there's also leaders, executives, managers, you name it. And we've even, this is probably too small for you to see easily, but we've even identified the different kinds of folks across the top that might be involved in an organization and the different things that they can do. We call them applications. And those X's are all places where performance thinking can help. So that's kind of the rationale for it. Work outputs, though, are where it's at, because what we want to do before we launch into looking at behavior is we want to talk about work outputs. And here's one of the tools that we use. We call it an individual performance map or a customer diagram. And the idea is we've got the performer, in this case, the sales director in the middle. And then we've got the people to whom the sales director deliver value, the VP of sales, the sales, the senior account manager, and the customer service team. And we have the work outputs that the sales director delivers to those people. Now, I'm sure this is not that familiar to most of you, but they'd be more familiar. Here's a clinical supervisor. And you can see all the things, the work outputs that a clinical supervisor delivers to the behavior techs, the clinical director, the parents, the clients, etc. So this is a way we would analyze the job of a clinical supervisor in terms of the valuable outputs that they produce. Or here's actually the CEO, founder, and owner of a pretty large ABA company, and I did this with him for a couple of years ago. And these are the things that he delivered to his various recipients or customers. So you can see we have a way of identifying work outputs for a role or an individual. And there's a whole process for interviewing people and so forth for doing that. But we also can look at processes. And as you probably know, whether they're defined or not, in most companies, value gets delivered processes. And this is a really simple process. This has 3 participants, and they're producing a requirements document, I think, or a content specification document. So the author has a documentation project plan, and then creates a draft, and then hands that off to the next person, and etc. And this is what's called a swim lane diagram among process nerds. And those are the outputs. The things that are in the boxes are the behavior, but each step in a process hopefully produces some value added output. So this is how we look at processes. And if you think about your world, whether you've defined it or not, these are some of the processes in ABA organizations. And so this is a short list, actually. There's probably more of them. But I suspect that anybody in this group, given who you said you were in the poll, can look at these, and you're probably involved in, contribute to, maybe manage, possibly design these processes. Now, what we know about processes is that in most organizations, in most industries, some of them are documented, some of them are implemented, some of them are effective, but very often there's enormous opportunities for improving the consistency, the execution, the output, the efficiency, etc., of these processes. So process in many contexts is sort of where it's at. And we'll come back to this, and I'm going to ask Shane a little bit about this topic. Shifting into leadership and management, one of the interesting things to think about is if you're a leader, manager, or supervisor, a lot of your outputs are behavior influences for the people that you supervise, manage, coach, lead. So this is a kind of a funky visual, but notice you got the leaders and managers. They sort of have control over those behavior influences, and they're arranging those conditions for their employees. In fact, in our webinar in January, we're going to talk in a lot more detail about this. Here's an example. A director of an educational program, all those blue things that are delivered by the director to the teachers are essentially behavior influences for the teachers. They either set expectations, provide feedback, are tools and resources, are consequences, etc. So if you're in a leadership, management, or supervisory position, a big part of your job is to arrange effective behavior influences for other people. And that's simple enough, but once stated, you can sort of begin to look more carefully at supervision and management. Now, when we think about that relationship and the relationship of the organization to its people, one of the things we've learned over the years, and that's what this guy is pointing to, is that, you know, if you're asking somebody to behave in a particular way, you should ask more questions, or you should do this with parents, or whatever it is. That's fine, but it's sometimes kind of hard to say, and if you do that, it'll really help the organization. On the other hand, if you say you're trying to develop a good partnering relationship with parents, that's your output. And you can see how if we do that, that's going to improve client satisfaction, probably operational efficiency, probably student outcomes. That's just one example. But if you look at any output that people produce, it's usually a lot easier to connect up those outputs with organizational level results than it is to sort of do that about, talk about behavior. And we can talk about that one way or the other, but that's one of the things we've learned over the years. But there's really more to it than that in terms of engaging people. Because one of the things we've also learned over the years, if you think about those 6 boxes, and you remember that box 6 is attitude, one of the things we've seen is if we can arrange the first 5 boxes, if we can be sure that expectations are clear and consistent, if we can be sure that people are getting consistent feedback about that, if we can give people the tools and resources and time and software and all the rest of it that they need to perform well, and that's working well, if we not only arrange consequences, but even better, enable people to achieve natural consequences, natural payoff of their work, if we're sure they have the right skills and knowledge and we put them in the right jobs, they're going to be pretty happy campers. But if we've screwed up on those first 5 boxes, and we've seen it over and over again in companies where there are employee retention issues, you're going to have somebody that kind of looks like that woman on the bottom. So we've kind of learned that historically in our work with organizations, not just in ABA, but in a lot of companies. But it really goes further than that. And I only discovered this maybe 7 years ago, but the Gallup organization, which probably most people know from kind of Gallup polling, has been working in the field of employee engagement for a long time. And this is a phrase that's been around for a while. And in most executive, teams that I know of in big companies, they're concerned about employee engagement. If they don't have engaged employees, they know they got a problem. And the reason is, this is some research that the Gallup people produced, is that on the Gallup survey for employee engagement, which I'll show you in a moment, what they've learned is that if you're doing well on that survey, if your employees are responding positively to those surveys, you got reduced absenteeism, you got reduced turnover, you've got less shrinkage, stealing if you're in a business where people can steal. You're safer, you have higher quality, and you have higher customer satisfaction, productivity, and profitability. Those are bottom line results that leaders and executives are paying attention to. And what they know is a predictive belief, frankly, with the surveys that Gallup does about employee engagement. And the surveys are very simple. This is what's called the Gallup 12. And the Gallup survey just has people rate from a scale of 1 to 5. To what extent do I know what's expected me of work? To what extent do I have the materials and equipment I need, and so forth? So I encountered this, as I said, a few years ago, and it hit me. I said, oh my gosh, if you sort these into our 6 boxes model, it's quite remarkable, because it kind of confirms what I was saying earlier. So what we've learned is that not only is our experience sort of true, that if you arrange all the behavior influences in these cells in a way that are positive and aligned and configured together, you get happy campers. But Gallup has now a couple of decades of data to make that clear. So what this has caused us to do is to recognize in the last few years that we can look at best practices for leaders, managers, and supervisors with those things in mind. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Again, we're going to do a webinar on this in January. But if you just look at some of the items on this graphic, you'll see that these are all things that leaders, managers, and supervisors can do to arrange conditions to support the performance of their people. And so this gives us a framework for looking at our management and leadership and supervision practices. And it also gives us a kind of a problem-solving framework for how could we improve them. Why are our employees not so happy? Well, let's take a look at this and see what's working and what's not. Now, if you really drive that forward and you focus on accomplishments, you can build an entire talent development and supervision process there. You can recruit people based on interviews that have to do with outputs. Like, tell me about, have you produced, let's say, IEPs before? Have you made decisions based on data? How have you developed good relationships with parents? In other words, you can use outputs as a foundation for interviews for recruitment. You can onboard people by saying, what are the outputs that people need to be able to produce reliably in the first 6 weeks in the job, and then after that? And you can build your onboarding program based on the valuable contributions people need to make. You can then do job readiness, essentially training on specific stuff around outputs. And then you can move people into a ongoing cycle that our accomplishment-based coaching program called the Performance Thinking Coach will help you do, in a way that people continue to develop their capabilities to deliver value. And then at appropriate points during the year, there may be things like promotions or transfers or sending people to a higher role in the job, and there may be compensation reviews. So when you focus on accomplishments and when you arrange conditions for people to perform well, you can drive your whole development and training function quite nicely. Now, I want to say briefly a couple things, and I think we are going to go over the hour, and I hope that's okay with people, because we'll be there in a minute. I want to ask Shane some things pretty soon to share his experience with us. But one of the things I recognize is that in speaking with you all, people in the ABA world know quite a lot about organizational behavior management, or OBM. And I have a lot of people come to me and say, hey, how can I get a job in OBM? And of course, I always say, well, you can't unless you're an OBM organization or ABA organization. You're going to have to be in training or instructional design or HR or some other known field to get a job in other kinds of companies. But in an ABA companies, you guys know about what OBM is. And so as I started thinking about how our work has sort of stepped beyond the usual OBM, I recognized, first of all, we start by focusing on valuable work outputs, whether it's analyzing a job or a role or a process. And then we identify the behavior needed to produce it. And that's a little different than most OBM approaches. We also, in the way that I showed you, can very much more clearly for individuals link people's behavior to organizational results by focusing on the valuable outputs that they produce that contribute to those results. Now, the 6 boxes model, in my view, is a more robust framework than the 3-term contingency because it takes into account things that the 3-term contingency really doesn't, like especially tools and resources, for example. You know, if you think about the lab from which the 3-term contingency came, we built levers and keys and stuff to match the organisms that we were studying in the lab. But in your daily work, you know, you got software and applications and job aids and reference materials and physical environments. Those all have to be tweaked. And that's just one example of how the 6 boxes model gives you a more robust framework. We also approach this, as my late colleague Don Tosti used to say, as a design engineering discipline. So because we're trying to configure and design whole systems, we can take all the things that OBMers are really good at, you know, things like scorecards and performance-based pay and et cetera, and we can put those into the 6 boxes to integrate them. And also, I would say in our work, we focus more on arranging all the conditions to help people be successful and make contact with the natural consequences than we do necessarily focus on raising people's performance through consequences. That's not to discount consequences. It's just to say that we can help people get to those natural consequences more easily when we build the system. So there are some differences where I think, of course, I have a bias, but I think where performance thinking adds to OBM. Now, here's where I want to stop for a moment, because as we, and let Shane talk, because one of the things is that as we look at ABA organizations, like in any companies, there's a lot of opportunities for improvement. But what we think is, for example, with processes, there's lots of opportunities to improvement. We've been in a lot of companies. When I first started doing some work in the California market for ABA companies, I was told that 40 to 60% turnover in frontline, like RBTs, was typical. Any other industry, the company would be dead. So even if you've got 20% turnover, staff retention is a costly thing. As one of our colleagues who was CEO of a medium-sized company told me a month or two ago, she said, you know, every person that we lose, it costs us something like $5,000 to ramp up a new person. So there's real dollar value in the staff retention issue, not just, you know, disruption of service, and then ongoing staff development. So I want to ask Shane, in your experience in working both your own companies and others, tell me a little bit about the process improvement opportunities and sort of what the payoff is for helping. Shane, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So, you know, in working with different organizations across the country, I would say that in my experience, that leaders in behavioral health organizations, the main processes they report challenges with tend to fall in sort of what, you know, we've kind of put in some categories or areas. Talent acquisition, development, and management. So processes like onboarding, new hire training, appointment management, which can include scheduling or case assignment or coding, and then billing, revenue cycle management, right? So things like writing session notes or converting appointments or scrubbing appointments. I mean, there's other areas in human resources like HR, documentation and management, and then of course in client relations and clinical processes. But those are sort of the main areas where I find that organizations in behavioral health organizations or ABA organizations have run into challenges, have difficulties.
And so sorry, I was just kind of giving you the stage there, but can you say a little bit of any examples of where you've helped with those and what kind of the payoff is?
Yeah, it will. So, I mean, I think first the reason why we've sort of focused on or I highlighted those is that there's a number of business results that are impacted by those processes not, performing optimally, right? So I think one obvious one is operational efficiency, but then also like you referred to employee retention, employee engagement. When processes are difficult and essentially they're punishing or their consequences are negative consequences, they're difficult, right? That really affects how someone feels about their job and so on and so forth. And then of course, I mentioned the billing and session notes and that obviously affects revenue and regulatory compliance. So these are not just sort of minor issues. They can have major impacts on organizations. And yeah, I mean, I would say that an example probably that everyone watching or most people could relate to, sort of the process that right now gives people the biggest headache would be scheduling or the processes that connect with scheduling. So like writing session notes, converting appointments, that type of thing. And so some of the things that I've done to help improve scheduling process is I first start off by learning, what is the current process and systems. And I do that by interviewing, observing, looking through documents. And, this may involve identifying the steps or now to use our terminology, sort of the outputs or sub outputs in the process. And then maybe I may map out, right, an is process using some type of software. Typically then I'll collaborate with a project team. And this is usually comprised of both people from the back office staff and practitioners and maybe the process manager or operations manager. And then basically together we map out a new process by identifying the performers, the outputs, and then criteria for a good one. At times, depending on what systems they've used and stuff, I may sort of do some investigating or exemplary behavior analysis by interviewing people maybe from other organizations that are using those systems. But I'm pretty familiar with the current systems used for scheduling and sort of effective processes for scheduling right now. So then we usually just move to brainstorming positive behavior influences that we can then arrange to develop and support performance for the employees. And then we work together to create an implementation plan to roll out the new process.
Yeah, so let me respond a little bit. Roger Addison, who's an longtime colleague in the performance improvement world, was pointing out in the chat box that ABA organizations have the same issues as a lot of organizations, and that's fair enough. One of the things that I see that I've observed, and I'm not as much of an insider as Shane is, but is that especially with the growth in the ABA business, a lot of companies, for example, have processes that are kind of tribal knowledge. They're not documented. They're kind of, everybody sort of knows how it works, but it's not really efficient. It hasn't gone through anything like what Shane just described. And so they have a new location, or they develop a new program, or they're growing by acquisition, and all of a sudden they're in 17 states. And their processes are not in a form to be replicated, to be executed consistently. So it actually sometimes threatens the success of the organization. There's an implosion that can happen when some of those processes are inefficient, are producing upset customers, or not working to, insurance reimbursement and threatening audits and all that kind of stuff. With the growth and expansion in this business, in this industry, I think processes are especially kind of at risk for those reasons. Has that been consistent with your observation, Shane? Is that pretty
Absolutely,
consistent?
especially when you're talking about the growth. And so whether they're just opening up new location in the same sort of metroplex, or if they're moving a location to a different state. At that time, right, your things, you're going to need to have your processes documented, right, and well managed. And in order to do that, you have to kind of go through those steps. And so,
I'm sorry.
No, I just
extending what you said earlier, Shane, about the possible impact of processes on staff retention, which is kind of the second topic here. Everybody knows if you walk into an organization and everything's kind of screwed out, working very well, you may not be so happy to work there after a while. And for me, one of the most dramatic examples, and I'm sure you have a lot more cases, but I was working for a larger ABA organization at one point, and I was coaching a project in our practitioner program where they were trying to look at employee retention. And they were trying to do this kind of top-down thing where they were trying to understand, well, how do we create a culture that works better and stuff? And so I said, why don't you just take your front line, your biggest employee group, which in this case was RBTs, basically, frontline providers, and just do an analysis of their jobs and then look at the behavior influences that are in place, the expectations, the feedback, the tools, and all that. And it became immediately obvious. These people had expectations, for example, that they ought to be developing relationships with parents, but they had policies that said you can't get billed for that. Or they had processes that they couldn't even figure out how to run, or they had policy and procedure documents that were not very usable. And so all those behavior influences really were running at cross purposes to one another. And when they started to clean that stuff up, it wasn't like voila, but all of a sudden people start like, okay, now I know how it works around here. I can walk in the morning and know what I'm supposed to be doing, et cetera. So I'm guessing you must see that a lot in the clients you serve, right, Shane? Is that true?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would say, so I think one of the ways that, I've certainly started to help organizations, take that step to first defining performance, right, before even then arranging positive behavior influences to support it. And so, one way that we've improved employee satisfaction and retention is starting off by creating job descriptions, but specifically accomplishment based or work output based job descriptions, right? And so when you sit down with a new employee and you go through what you showed earlier, individual performance map, right? And you show them who they deliver value to by identifying their customers, what's valuable that they produce, and how those connect to the business results, how they instantly can start making an impact in the organization, right? That really resonates with people. I mean, this work is hard, it's difficult. And so it's important, especially those that work, directly with clients. You want to show how they add that value, and starting off by identifying work outputs and then linking them to business results is a great way to do that. And then, to be honest, most job descriptions don't include criteria, right? But the ones that we develop do. So then they can see this is what the expectations are from the organization. And then how am I performing against that, right? And that provides people that natural feedback, and that really resonates with people in this field, especially.
Yeah, we had a blog that reminds me of a blog post we did probably a year ago, but there was a Harvard Business Review article about feedback and how it works and how it doesn't work. And I realized that because we do what you said, which is we define what a good treatment plan is, what a good instructional decision is, what a good relationship is, that once you define the product of the behavior, it's a heck of a lot easier for the performer to say, oh, I was successful or not. Mm-hmm. Now, they may still need their supervisor's help to diagnose what behavior they can change or what they can do differently. But there's a certain amount of feedback built in when you set explicit criteria for good outputs that starts to put it in the hands of the performer. So that goes to the third topic, and I want to mention there's been a few questions in the chat box here that we'll try to get to at the end here, and we are going to go over the hour a little bit, obviously, but you guys will all get a link to the recording in it, like 36 hours. But the staff development thing is another piece, and we made quick reference to our coaching program, but Shane has been introducing our performance thinking coach program at ABA organizations for quite a few years now. And what we basically teach supervisors or managers to do is define the outputs of the people they're supervising, not just the behavior, not just the tasks, but the actual products of their behavior. And then once they're very clear on expectations for that, let's pick something that to improve or to add to your capability or maybe to get ready for the next level. And let's think about what it is that you need to be able to do to produce that relationship, that decision, that document, those treatment notes, whatever they are. And then let's use the 6 boxes to have a conversation about what we could do to help improve. And so the deal is, if you put that in place, like that diagram I showed much earlier, you've got an ongoing process where supervisors working directly with their people are continuously developing their people. And so you've done a lot of that, Shane, both in your own business and in client organizations. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of what happens when you introduce that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the most powerful thing about this approach is that it puts the power of performance thinking into the leaders and managers' hands who can directly change the performance of the people that report to them, right? So that they became I think a few things I would highlight. One is especially when new employees see that their manager takes the time to sit down with them, to select something to work on, and then goes through the analyze, brainstorm, choose step with respect to behavior influences, that it says to the performer that, wow, look at me as a supervisor or manager. I'm responsible or largely responsible for arranging expectations, providing you feedback, giving you the right tools, making sure that we're delivering consequences that function as reinforcers, right? And so many people have called this process like very thorough and very it reduces stress upon the performers. Now they have somebody who's thinking about what they need and helping them achieve better performance. I also like how it focused development on 1 or 2 work outputs. Let's be honest, this like to be a clinical supervisor or behavior technician or director, these are very complicated jobs, right? That require a lot of skills and knowledge and sort of a diverse, repertoire of performance. And so when you can kind of say, no, let's prioritize and focus on this. Let's work together. Let's come up with some agreed upon action steps. You make progress faster, that they're much more engaged. And I mean, this might be getting way down too much in the weeds, but to be honest, like when I first became a supervisor, or when at least the requirements by the BACB came out that says here's the requirements to be a supervisor, it listed a lot of things, but it didn't really teach you how to do them or give you a framework to produce the outputs in there. And so, our program does that, and especially for new managers, that's really helpful and really important.
That little testimonial that I shared at the beginning was from the owner of the ABA company, and she actually had said in public that 6 boxes, quote, saved her business, which I thought was an exaggeration, but when she talked to me, I realized it wasn't. One of the things she said is the first thing she and her colleagues learned was our coaching methodology. And what she said was, when she and her leadership and supervisory team started looking at people's performance this way through the lens of the 6 boxes model, so they were trying to optimize all those conditions to support people. They weren't just like whacking them if they didn't do their jobs or giving them consequences if they did. They were arranging it all to make it work. That's what she said shifted it from being a place where people were there because they got a paycheck and sometimes the work was good, to a place where they really wanted to work because, like you were saying, it was clear that the company cares about me, that I'm going to have an opportunity to continue to develop, that it's not just going through more training, but it's actually ongoing development.
On the job,
and at least
on the job performance improvement.
Right. And what I've again, I'm sort of an outsider because I have so many colleagues and friends in the ABA world. But I've been working in companies, mostly big companies, for years. But I keep hearing over and over again to the effect that kind of in a lot of companies, supervision is kind of a mess. And I believe that a big way to shift that is to go from sort of the task list model, if you will, or the behavior-based model, to what we're talking about here, which is focus on the valuable contributions that each individual needs to make and helping them make them. And anyway, thank you, Shane. I think it's a big deal. And it also can, over time, establish a culture in your organization where we're here about continuous development, continuous improvement, whether it's for individuals or processes or the whole environment. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, just to add one more point about that is that you talked about it being a problem-solving framework. And I think instead of blaming the performer or, making excuses, people learn to come together and say, okay, the performance is not where we need to be. Let's look at the lens of the 6 boxes and figure out what we can change. It empowers the manager and leaders.
Yeah. And it's a continuous, the word agile is a big deal all over these days. And agile basically means, incremental improvement over time. And that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about increasingly tightening up the environment to support people. So in the interest of time, I'm noticing, we're about 10 minutes more than an hour. I wanted to talk about a couple more things. So thank you, Shane. I appreciate Shane, believe me, I've interviewed Shane before. He could go on quite a bit. He's worth talking to. So, find a way to be in touch with him. But what I wanted to just overview here quickly was what we offer. We offer a lot of programs. If you go to 6boxes.com, you'll see we have programs for leaders and managers, which include that coaching program. We also do executive coaching. We've got our practitioner program, which, for example, a lot of training and development groups have used it to become performance improvement groups. And these are the ones that we think would be of interest to ABA companies. This is sort of the shameless commerce moment, because we do have services to offer. We provide consulting services as needed, but frankly, the focus of the Performance Thinking Network is to empower you and then to coach and help you apply these in your organization. So a lot of our work is about building internal capacity in organizations. So the coaching program, the leadership modules, which basically build on that, the practitioner program, which a lot of ABA people have gone through at this point, training and development people or leadership people or operations people trying to become better at doing all of this at a systems level. And then we have also some ongoing things where we can even certify people in bigger companies to deliver these programs. We also have something that this is the first time we've announced it, and it's really just kind of a trial balloon here. But because of Shane's experience of improving a lot of processes in a lot of companies, and my observation, and not just ABA companies, but that processes is to a large extent where it's at, what we are beginning, and we have a colleague, Austin Siebert from Western Michigan, who works with us now, who's done a fair amount of process work, just as Shane has, just as I have. We're embarking on a little research project. And what we'd like to do is anybody in a leadership position in an ABA company who's interested in participating, you can email us at research@6boxes.com. But what we want to do is we're going to have a survey to basically ask, like, what processes exist in your organization, which ones are documented or not, how's that working for you? And we'll keep it anonymous, so don't worry about that. But we want to get a kind of survey of a larger number of organizations than we've been able to serve so far, and kind of report back, what's the status of documentation, implementation of processes in the ABA world. And then we want to see, depending on what we learn, and add to Shane's experience and our experience of focusing on the ones where there's the biggest potential upside. And then what we're planning is, if some people are interested in this, we want to do at least a webinar and provide some recommendations to those who want to participate for how to work on your processes. And then, of course, we can engage you in our programs, we can consult with you. But we think this will be a useful thing in the ABA marketplace, the ABA industry, for really bringing to the fore what processes are important, which ones are being effectively implemented and integrated with systems like Central Reach and some of the other software systems, and kind of where do people need help. So we just wanted to announce that. And if you're interested, you can contact us at research@sixboxes.com. We've also got a couple more programs coming up. We run our practitioner program, which is sort of for doing big projects, and you can read about it on our website. Every couple of months, we have an open version of that program that anybody can sign up for. And the next one is starting in early January, and we've still got some open seats. And then Shane's going to do an open virtual coach program for people who want to sort of taste that program starting in March. And there'll be more information available about that. And if you're interested, you can go to info@sixboxes.com. And then every year for 10 years, we've run the Summer Institute, and it's a wonderful thing. You can check out some of the feedback about it on our YouTube channel at performancethinking.tv. We don't know if we're going to be able to do it in June because COVID might still be preventing travel. But put these dates, June 13th to 17th, in your calendar in case we run it, in case you might be interested. If we don't run it because of COVID, we're probably going to do some alternative thing. But this is a wonderful participatory experience with people from a lot of industries sharing this stuff and looking at new applications and so forth. So put that in your calendar. And then there's a few questions that I want to respond to in the chat box. And here's some information for you. But just looking at the chat box, let's see here. We've got
the first question was from Jeffrey, who said, "Where do competency fit in the performance chain?" I went ahead and marked the questions for you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so you don't want to get me off on competencies too much. I will give you a harangue on competencies. I think competencies are the emperor has no clothes. Competency models arose some decades ago where people were looking at the behavior of leaders. They listed 100 and some behaviors, sort of best practices behavior. That was too much to deal with. They sorted them into clusters. They named the clusters. Those became competencies. And now what happens is people organize their training programs with competencies. They do their performance management systems by rating people on competencies, which is refined opinion at best. I think it undermines every approach to effective performance management, performance improvement. So that's my nice version. I think competencies are one of the worst things that's ever happened in the corporate world, but training organizations and consulting organizations have made hundreds of millions of dollars on them, and companies have spent that, so it's hard to dislodge them. And there's a couple blogs. If you go to sixboxes.com, look in the blog, you'll find some blogs about this. What I would recommend about competencies is you can list your competencies in skills and knowledge if you want. But frankly, I would rather know the specific skills and knowledge needed for the specific behavior that produces the specific work outputs or accomplishments. And what we think is, I've talked to a lot of senior leaders in HR in some big companies, and if I get them in a room privately, they'll tell me competencies are horrible, they don't help, but we don't know what else to do. And so what we believe is focusing on accomplishments or work outputs is the next step. So anyway, I don't want to get too haranguey about it, but that's my response to that topic. Sorry.
The next one, else? Yeah, the next question is, which factors may reduce employee turnover? We covered that a lot, but I don't know if you wanted to add.
Well, I think you said a lot of it, Shane. What we see is that if you look at the beauty of the Six Boxes model, it is both simple, plain English, and comprehensive. I was trained as a behavior scientist by Fred Skinner and B. Barrett and Og Lindsley, and I've been an applied person and a practitioner and a consultant for 40 years. I've yet to see anything that influences performance that doesn't fit into either one of those cells or relationships between the cells. And so what I would argue is, if you look at the Six Boxes model and you be sure that the things that you're providing to support your people are positive, aligned, and coordinated and are not in conflict with one another, you're going to get far better retention. And so that's a gross statement, but there ain't just one. You can, people are poaching, BCBAs from the company down the street by offering them a few more bucks an hour, and that may be work in the short term. But if you move into a company and you're all excited about your new job, and in the first 6 months you realize, God, I'm getting different expectations from different supervisors. These tools suck. I really, et cetera, et cetera. You're not going to be happy and you're not going to be productive. And if the better deal comes along, you're going to take it. So I would say it's the whole system, but the 6 boxes lets you look at it with respect to how you're doing it. So you might want to add to that, Jane. But
Well, I think that that's a great point. Is that you often see organizations cherry pick what we would say would be performance or behavior influences in one or two of the cells. So let's offer really large salaries, sort of box
Right.
3, but then let's not make a clinical director available to help them develop their performance as clinicians, right? Or right. And let's just provide lots of maybe didactic training as a solution, right? So there's many ways that I have seen people try to intervene in there, but again, I'm with you. It's really when you optimize the 6 boxes and you build a culture where leaders and managers take responsibility and accountability for planning and arranging those positive behavior influences. Then you're gonna have some happy employees.
Well, and I've heard, again, it's sort of an outsider, but I've heard a lot of stories from small to medium-sized owners who say, well, the big guy moved into my territory and offered a lot more money and stole all my best people, but they started coming back when they realized what it was like to work there. So like you're saying, money isn't that's not it. There's another question in here from Raman. What types of reinforcement or incentives have been successful? Now, I'm not a big reinforcement incentives guy. I'd like to arrange the conditions so that people perform well. But for example, Brett DeNovi is an old friend and colleague of mine. And I think there are some of our colleagues in companies, including Brett DeNovi Associates, that do a super job, not only of performance-based sorts of systems, but also of point systems for accomplishing certain things, for levels of participation. I think if you do a good job of it, you can make it so that the things that people do well are recognized at a whole lot of levels. And so to me, it's not just about point interventions of what kind of reinforcement you're going to use or what kind of thing to use. It's more like we're saying now, it's let's arrange the conditions so that your staff are likely to get happy smiles from parents, meet goals with kids, support from supervisors when they need it, tools that work well. If you do all that stuff, you're going to put people in contact with the natural payoff. And to me, that's what sustains performance. That's how I would answer that question. There were a couple others too that you marked here. The insurance industries, I don't know.
Yeah, that's sort of beyond our scope, I think.
Yeah, I think we responded to Rita's question. We responded to Constance's question.
Elizabeth,
anybody else
interested in learning how she might sort of get into this line of work? And I think that, my first suggestion would be to look into taking one of our open practitioner programs. I mean, I even though we've known each other for almost 20 years, I took the practitioner program when I owned one of my behavioral health companies. And I started doing the work in my own organizations before then consulting with others. So I think that if for anyone that is looking to expand their skills and knowledge as a performance practitioner, I would highly recommend that program.
Well, and it's worth noting that you studied with Cloyd Heighton, who's one of the brilliant guys in the field of OBM. So it's not like you came in not knowing about stuff. And so clearly,
talk about cherry pick. Like Aubrey Daniels cherry picked him out of the University of North Texas and lured him away from academia.
So apparently we added some value to that. I highly recommend go to our website at 6boxes.com and check out the practitioner program. Go to the YouTube channel and you'll get a bunch, which is performancethinking.tv, and you'll get a bunch of sort of little bits about our work. And then reach out to me if you want, Carl Binder at 6boxes.com. I'm always getting questions from graduate students and young professionals about this. And of course, the first thing I say is, except ABA organizations, you're not going to be doing work in OBM. You're going to be a performance improvement professional, or you're going to be a training person. You got to have another label, because people don't even know what OBM means outside of our little industry. But there's skill set that we can help you learn. And I love working with young colleagues and helping that transition to happen. We got some really sharp people been showing up recently, so it's a lot of fun. Any other questions? We could go on and on, as you can tell, but we should probably
There
bring
was a
this to a
question about
close.
measuring job satisfaction. If so,
Oh
how
yeah.
do you
Oh yeah, there you go. I don't have that much experience with that. I have a lot of colleagues who have different versions. I actually think the Gallup 12 is a pretty good thing. You can look up the Gallup 12 on Google and get those 12 questions, and they're really questions that you rate from sort of not at all, 1 to a whole bunch, 5, and then you look at how people, how people play out. Look at that. Now, I'm not a big survey fan because people do voodoo math with surveys. They add up all the numbers and divide them by the number of people and come up with, well, I got a 3.85, which it means absolutely nothing because it's an ordinal scale if you want to get nerdy about it. But if you do like Amazon.com and you say, how many people said it was a 5? How many people said it was a 4? How many people said it was a 3? Oh, there's a whole bunch of ones. How come? Let's talk to them. If you do it that way, so you're actually counting people who said it was great, not so great, etc., you will get feedback. And especially if you then ask them what would be better, I think then you'll get real information. There's another bit, and we could go on and on, as I said, but I had a colleague that went through one of our programs years ago in a software company, actually, and he built a thing called what do you call it? Skip level meetings, which a lot of companies do, where like a director talks to a frontline person. In other words, they go 2 clicks down from their level in the organization and they talk to people and they say, how's it going? Well, what he did is he built that conversation around the 6 boxes. Like how are you getting clear expectations? Are they consistent? How about feedback? Do you get enough feedback? Would you like more? What about what about the tools, resources, processes, etc.? So they would have conversations with people, and then they would summarize what they learned and they'd look at it and say, how can we improve our management practices? And it would always go back to the 6 boxes. How can we improve that? So I think surveys are helpful. But frankly, I think that if you implement, as Shane was saying, if you implement the coaching program that's focused on accomplishments and uses the 6 boxes as a framework for improving, people's work environment, I think you're going to get feedback at an individual level about how it's growing, and you'll have ongoing improvement. There's another thing that I don't think I'm sharing anything out of school here, but I think one of the brilliant things that I learned from Brett Denovy Associates was they have a mentoring process, as I understand it. And I think Matt Linder was here, so he could tell me if I'm wrong. But I think essentially the way it worked was if every week you filled out as part of your little survey thing that you did every week about how your mentoring process was that week. And I was in an executive meeting at that company where if you get anything less than a 5, some senior person calls you and says, how's it going? They don't say, oh, you got a 4. How come? No, it's not like that. But there's an effort to reach out to anybody who is having an experience with less than optimal. I think that's the way to do it. I don't think it's about surveys. I think it's about feedback where we can address the needs of the individual. So it comes back to coaching and mentoring and supervision, I think. Right. Anyway, I think we're done. I appreciate everybody sticking around for the extra time. This webinar has been recorded. We'll add a couple front end pieces to it and stuff, but it will be out. I believe you'll get an email about 36 hours for a link, and it will get posted on our YouTube channel eventually, so you can see it there too. So I want to thank everybody. I really want to thank Shane for sharing some of your expertise and experience, and thank you everybody for tuning in, as they say.